This week's case takes place in the 18th century, but it's still being talked about today. So, let's get started. Hello everyone, my name is Brandy, and every Friday I bring you a true crime case or mystery with one or more of my fabulous felines. There's Billy up here in the basket if you can kind of see her. Everybody just ate, so they're probably going to go nap now. So I got a new microphone. I got a Blue Yeti. Isn't it fabulous? Here's what it used to sound like on my videos. This week's case is about a family murder that has been unsolved for over 40 years. And now I sound like this, so I hope the sound is richer. It's almost like a DJ. Welcome back to True Crime and Felines, where we'll be listening to the smooth sounds of a cat's meow. For my returning subscribers, welcome back, my feline friends. And a big shout out to my feline fans who help support this channel. Okay, sorry, I couldn't resist. I'm still getting used to the microphone, so hopefully as I, learn more about it, the sound will become better and better. But I hope this is a big step up from what I used to sound like. All right, so let's get started on the case. So Elizabeth Canning was born September 7th, 1734. In London. So we're going across the sea here. Now, she was the oldest of 5 children, and her parents were William, who was a carpenter, and her mom, who was named Elizabeth as well. She took care of the family. Now, the family did live in what was considered a respectful neighborhood, but they were still in poverty. They occupied a 2-room flat. 7 people in a 2-room flat. Now, tragedy struck in 1751 when Elizabeth was 17 years old. Her father had passed away. Now, this left her mother more destitute because her mother never had a job. She took care of the family the whole time. So, in order to bring in money, Elizabeth's mother sublet one of the rooms to an apprentice named James Lord. So James would occupy the front room, and the remaining family of 6 would occupy the back room. So little tight living space. Now, Elizabeth had very little schooling, but she did know how to read and write for the most part, so she could get by. So at age 16, to again help with the family, she became a maid servant. Now, a maid servant was sometimes referred to like as a slave, but in Elizabeth's case, she was actually hired and paid for her work as a maidservant. She was hired by a local publican, John Wintleberry. A publican is someone who owns a pub. So he owned a bar, so he kind of had some money to throw around. Now, Elizabeth was known to be shy, but everybody said that she was honest. So it wasn't like she was this wild girl, right? She did her job and went back home to her family. She was described as a plumper girl, stood about 5 feet tall. She had wide set eyes, and when Elizabeth was a child, she actually obtained smallpox, and that left her face like scarred. Now, by age 18, Elizabeth was making her own money, and to kind of ease the tight situation with the family, she ended up moving out of the family's 2-room flat, well, the 1-room flat now. And she ended up renting a room next door from a man named Edward Lyons. So she could still see her family and still go to work, and everything was fine, and she had her own space. Now, on January 1st, 1753, Elizabeth disappeared. So Elizabeth didn't have to work that day, so her plan was to spend time with her family. They were going to go visit an aunt and uncle, and then after that, she was supposed to go shopping with her mother. While visiting her aunt and uncle, Elizabeth decided that she'd rather stay and visit longer with her aunt and uncle instead of going shopping with her mom. So Elizabeth stayed with her aunt and uncle until about 9 p.m. that night, and then she decided to head for home. Now, her aunt and uncle did walk with her, like 2/3 of the way back to her place, and then they left her alone for the remaining third of the way. A couple hours later, Edward Lyons, who owned the room that Elizabeth was renting, noticed that Elizabeth had not come back home when she usually had. So Edward had gone next door to talk to Elizabeth's mother to see if Elizabeth was over there or if Elizabeth's mother knew where she was. Well, her mother had no idea where she was and stated that she should have been back home by now. So Elizabeth's mother sent the remaining children out into the streets that night looking for their sister. Then Elizabeth's mother sent James Lord, who was lodging in the house, over to Elizabeth's aunt and uncle's house to see if maybe she was still over there. Now, her aunt and uncle had stated that we started walking home about 9, and at 9:30 we left her by the church because it wasn't too far from her place, so she thought the rest of the way she would be safe. So they started asking neighbors and people that lived around the church if they saw Elizabeth, and nobody did. Elizabeth's mother, siblings, and other relatives scoured the city for weeks, but to no avail. They didn't find her. Now, notices would be put in the newspapers, and churches were asked to pray for Elizabeth's safe return. Now, the only report that anybody got was that on January 1st, that late at night, a woman's shriek, or like a scream, was heard coming from a hackney carriage. Now, a hackney carriage was considered like a higher cost carriage. It was an expensive carriage. So, whoever drove that carriage had a little bit of money. But, they didn't know whose carriage it was. They didn't have a description of the carriage, so there was no way they could actually follow up on it. But other than that, there were no clues to what happened to Elizabeth. She just vanished. Until a month later, on January 29th, Elizabeth just suddenly shows up at her mother's house. Her mother had been frantically searching for Elizabeth for weeks, and she was so shocked to see Elizabeth that she just fainted. Now, Elizabeth's mother was taken inside by some neighbors until she came back into consciousness. It wasn't long before, word of mouth got out that Elizabeth was home. And the house just started, this 2-room house just started filling with neighbors and gawkers and everybody that wanted to know Elizabeth's story. And word even got back to Elizabeth's employer, John Wintleberry, that she was back, so he arrived at the house as well. So everyone stated that Elizabeth was in terrible, deplorable condition. She had lost weight. Her face and hands were just black with dirt. All she was wearing was undergarments, that they used to wear under their dressings, like a petticoat and stuff. That's all she was wearing, and it was all dirty and ripped and torn. And she had a rag tied around her head, and it was soaked in blood on one side because she had an injury to her ear that was bleeding. Now, once they got Elizabeth settled, she began telling her story of what happened to her. She said that after her aunt and uncle had parted ways, she was walking past the Bedlam Hospital when 2 men attacked her. Now, the Bedlam Hospital, in case you don't know, is a very famous psychiatric hospital. It really has no place in the story, but just wanted to give you some trivia. Now, she said the 2 men that, attacked her, they partially stripped her, they robbed her, and then they hit her on the head and knocked her unconscious. Now, when she awoke, it was still, dark out, and she said that she was in a carriage, and she said that she was on a road that was next to a body of water, and the 2 men that abducted her, was pulling her out of the carriage, and then they forced her to walk into a house where she said an old woman was waiting for her. Now, the old woman asked Elizabeth if she would go their way, which back then meant will you be a prostitute? Of course, Elizabeth refused. And the woman ended up slapping her across the face and then cutting off her like corset. Then like stripped her down to just her undergarments, her petticoat. And then they ended up shoving her upstairs in the house into a loft and locked her in. Now, in this loft, Elizabeth stated that she had no visitors for the whole time she was there, not even like people coming saying, "Are you ready to be a prostitute?" Nothing like that. And that when she was locked in there, there was like a pitcher of water and there was like a loaf of bread. So for a full month, she just survived on that water and bread. So eventually, Elizabeth stated that, you know, after weeks of being locked in this loft, she discovered that there was some loose boards that were covering a window in the loft. And so she was able to pull those boards off, climb out the window, find a way down from the second story, and where she probably jumped, hence her injuries. She then said that she walked through some like fields and everything until she found a road that went to London. And she stated from the time she jumped like out the window and escaped till the time she showed up at her mom's house, she estimated it was probably about 5 hours. So during her abduction, when she was pulled out of the carriage, she believed that she was on a road called Hertford because there was a pond by that road as well. And she remembered hearing the name like Wills or Wells as the two men talked back and forth. Now, John Wintlebury, Elizabeth's employer, and another man named Robert Scarrett stated that based on her description, she had to be in the house of who they known as Mother Susanna Wells. Now, Mother Susanna Wells was known to dabble in prostitution, and she lived on Hertford Road where the pond was. So that's got to be it, right? And that house where Susanna Wells lived was only 10 miles away from London. So after Elizabeth told her story to everyone, an apothecary was brought in who acted as a doctor back then, and he gave Elizabeth medicine to help her, but she was so weak and frail and she had a faint pulse. She couldn't keep anything down and she ended up vomiting up the medicine that he gave her orally. So the apothecary then gave Elizabeth several enemas until he felt that she was getting better. Elizabeth was probably very dehydrated. So now a warrant was issued for Susanna Wells' arrest. And the next day, the London Daily Advertiser, which was the newspaper at the time, had printed the entire story. So, of course, once the story was printed, Susanna Wells was pretty much considered guilty. Now, on February 1st, peace officers arrived to, act on the warrant that was issued. Elizabeth was being pressured into, identifying her captors at the Wells' house. Now, Elizabeth was still weak and, needed more days to recover. But many of her supporters felt that, Elizabeth could die because she was such in a frail state. So Elizabeth was loaded up in a carriage and she was taken to the Wells' home 10 miles away where peace officers were waiting. Now, the Wells' house served several functions. It served as a carpenter shop, a butcher shop, an ale house. Susanna kept live animals in the house, and she also let lodgers stay and rent a place to sleep. So there was a lot of goings on going in and out of that house. Susanna had been twice widowed. Her first husband was a carpenter and he died of natural causes. And her second husband was actually hung because he got convicted of theft. Theft was a huge criminal offense back then. So Susanna herself was known to be a prostitute, but also had once been imprisoned for perjury in 1736. So Susanna wasn't viewed as a, upstanding citizen. So when peace officers made their way into the house, inside there was Susanna, an old woman named Mary Squires with her children, and a woman named Virtue Hall. There was also another woman who was a little bit younger, and they just assumed that she was one of Susanna's children. Now, Mary Squires' son, John, actually lived close by, and he was at the house at the time as well. And he was actually assumed to be one of Elizabeth's abductors. So the peace officers went through the house, and they ended up going upstairs where there was a loft, and inside they found a woman inside the loft. Now, she wasn't locked in, she wasn't trapped in there or anything. Her name was Judith Nodis, and she claimed that she was just renting a space to sleep, and that's where they put her, was the loft. Now, when officers, kind of searched the loft for any evidence, they were surprised to discover that the loft didn't really fit the description of how Elizabeth said the loft looked like. However, one peace officer went over to the window where there were boards covering it, and they were surprised to see that, there was no boards ripped off, but they stated that it looked like the window had been boarded up recently. So that was enough for them to be like, this got to be it, right? So Elizabeth and her mother arrived by carriage, and Elizabeth was literally carried inside. She could barely walk. She was so weak. Now, once inside, Elizabeth pointed the finger at Mary Squires and stated that that was the woman who slapped her across the face and cut off her corset. Elizabeth then pointed at Virtue Hall and the other younger woman, assumed to be Susanna's daughter, and stated that they were present when all this went down as well, that they actually didn't do anything to her, but they witnessed everything. They then carried Elizabeth upstairs to the loft, and Elizabeth stated that yes, that was the loft that she was in, although when she was in there, it had less hay in it. So after all of this, Virtue Hall and Mary Squires were taken into custody, and Susanna Wells was taken into custody for keeping a disorderly house. Now, this is not that her house was dirty or had animals running through it or anything like that. Back then, a disorderly house meant that, your inhabitants that you had in your house were like a public nuisance, or they were corrupt, or basically they were criminals, that you were aiding and abetting criminals. Now, Virtue Hall, once she was taken into custody, was very adamant that she had no involvement, no knowledge, didn't even know who Elizabeth was, never seen her before in her life. For whatever reason, they believed her, and they ended up setting her free. Now, Virtue ended up spending time kind of in a psych hospital over all this, and so she wasn't really free. So in England during this time, an assault was not considered a criminal matter because, people got in fights all the time and would beat each other up in the street and stuff. So instead, the way the police and the judges and the courts viewed assault or fighting or whatever, that was a civil manner, and it was a dispute that two parties would need to work out on their own. That meant that Elizabeth herself was responsible for investigating the whole abduction, the assault where they hit her in the head, and keeping her hostage, because it was all considered a civil manner. She was responsible for, investigating that crime, gaining the proof that it happened. And it was also on Elizabeth to, file a civil lawsuit, so to speak, on the, attack, abduction, and assault. When you have to file the lawsuit yourself, you have to pay for it. And this was an expensive endeavor for a maidservant. The other issue was that the courts in civil matters like this preferred that the parties somehow reconcile or come to an agreement instead of playing it out in trial. So there was a lot of pressure for Elizabeth to just work it out with Susanna and Mary and not take the whole thing to trial. Now, here's the other side to that. So the whole story about Mary Squires allegedly cutting off Elizabeth corset. Now, a corset could be a very expensive item. And because Elizabeth escaped the home and wasn't able to get the corset back, that was considered theft, that Mary stole the corset. And that was a criminal matter that would have to play out in the courts. Confused yet? So let's break this down for modern times, okay? Thank God times have changed. But let's say that this was still a law. This was still the way it was today. So let's say you're out walking, somebody attacks you, knocks you out, abducts you, and then keeps you prisoner for a month. In that time, they take your cell phone away, right? So you can't call anybody. So you're imprisoned for a month, you escape, and you're not able to get your cell phone back for obvious reasons, and you run to the cops. The cops tell you that, well, you need to work it out with your abductor and come to some, agreement for them attacking you, knocking you out, and imprisoning you. But them taking your cell phone is a major deal, so we will take care of that. Can you imagine? Okay, so anyway, Elizabeth is finally getting the medical treatment that she needs. She's resting, she's recovering, and she has many supporters. And they're helping to prepare this case for her. Mary Squires and Susanna Wells, they had supporters as well. There wasn't as many, but there was a split in the case of who believed who from the start. In order to pay for this case, because again, Elizabeth would have to front the money for this, relatives and supporter of Elizabeth had solicited donations, and then they actually created a pamphlet that they had printed up that people could buy, and it was called The Case of Elizabeth Canning. And it read almost like a storybook. There was, illustrations in there, and it explained what happened to Elizabeth. In the pamphlet, of course, Susanna was depicted as a monster of a woman, because she wasn't of good social standing. And Mary Squires was referred to as an old gypsy woman. They were depicted as monsters in this story, and Elizabeth was the angel, the victim, right? Now, many people agreed that Mary Squires, she wasn't an attractive woman. Now, they described her as being anywhere from 60 to 80 years old. Really? 20-year range? You can't get that a little tight? Anyway. Anybody even ask her how old she was? Anyway, she was also explained as hardy, which meant overweight. And she had a large nose. And she had a lower lip that was swollen and disfigured from the disease scrofula. Okay, so scrofula is an infection of the lymph nodes, which creates lesions on the neck and on the face. Now, 90% of adult cases, this came about because they had tuberculosis and it went untreated. So anyway, the gist of, this pamphlet, this story that was being put out there was, this sweet 18-year-old girl was, held captive by an old gypsy woman and a monster of a woman, and trying to force her into prostitution, and but she escaped and she returned to her loving family, so you can imagine. Now, of course, the public found this story irresistible. They actually had to print more pamphlets over time because people were buying them and actually making a lot of money for Elizabeth to go through with this trial. So now that they had some money, they hired this guy named Henry Fielding. Now, Henry had wrote a book in December of 1751 entitled Amelia. This is a story about a young woman who deals she marries this guy, and this guy is just constantly getting himself in trouble and, cheating on her, and just her life, basically. But Henry did have some criminology background, and he supposedly was known as knowing the lengths that human beings would go to either protect or do criminal activities to get money and stuff like that. So they figured he was a good person to be on Elizabeth's side. And Henry also prided himself on fairness, no matter the social standing of someone, he never used that against them. He said he was well trained in the art of spotting a lie. So Henry issued warrants to everyone that was in the Wells's house, and they were to appear before him, and basically what he was doing is he was doing interviews with them. So Virtue Hall was brought in from her psych bed, and he also talked to Judith Natus, who was the one that was living in the loft. But like various other key people of the Wells's household seemed to disappear and couldn't be found. So the woman that was believed to be Susanna's daughter, she disappeared. Mary's son John, who was believed to be one of the abductors, he disappeared as well. They just kind of skedaddled out of town. So Henry was questioning Virtue Hall, and who was stating that, again, like, she knew nothing of this abduction. She's never met Elizabeth. Like, she just doesn't know what's going on, pretty much. But Henry, you know, with his training to spot a lie, stated that her answers were contradictory. So then Henry got mad and actually threatened Virtue with putting her in prison for lying. And then all of a sudden, Virtue suddenly made a confession. So Virtue told a story that Mary's son John and another man that she doesn't know brought Elizabeth to the house the morning, like early morning hours of January 2nd. Once Elizabeth was brought in the house, Virtue was there, Mary Squires, of course, and Mary's daughter, Lucy. Now, this is the young woman that everybody thought was Susanna Wells's daughter. It was actually Mary's daughter, Lucy, okay? So these three women are in this house at this time. Mary Squires is the one that slapped Elizabeth and cut off her corset, according to Virtue. And then Mary and Lucy were the one that forced Elizabeth into the loft. Virtue stated that she didn't have anything to do with it. She was just a witness, pretty much. She said that Elizabeth was up there for some weeks, about a month, and then once they realized that Elizabeth had escaped, that Judith Natus, she was one that was, you know, living in the loft, they said that she had been staying at the Wells's house for about 2 weeks before Elizabeth was abducted. And once they found that Elizabeth escaped, they moved Judith and her husband up to the loft to make it look like it was being lived in the whole time. When Henry interviewed Judith Natus about this, Judith had corroborated that, yes, her and her husband and actually another lodger were living in the loft separated by like a sheet or a piece of cloth or something, and that she was living up there the whole time in January, and she knew nothing of this abduction or Elizabeth or anything. But again, Henry had stated in his notes that he wasn't convinced Judith was telling the truth. Now, in the end, after Henry Fielding's investigation and everything, Mary Squires stood trial for assault in the civil court and theft of the corset in the criminal court. But they kind of combined it together. And Susanna stood at trial for the well-knowing of what was going on in her house, even though she didn't participate or was even there. Again, the theft charge is what was most serious here. Like, if Mary was found guilty of the theft of this corset, she was looking at the death penalty. Like, they were pretty brutal back then on this. So Elizabeth was put on the stand, and there she told her story again, and it didn't waver at all from her initial story. She said she escaped from the window by pulling off some boards and jumping to the ground, and ran through some fields until she finally found a road that led to London. She stated that she did not talk to anyone, and if she passed anyone on the road, she looked down because she didn't want to be recognized by any occupants that may have been living in the house and where they would take her back. Next on the stand was Virtue Hall, who stated again that she was innocent. She was just a witness. She didn't do anything, but pretty much stuck to the story that she told Henry. Now, Mary Squires, when she was put on the stand, stated that Her and her children were actually out of town selling goods from January 1st to like January 9th, and then again on like January 12th through the end of the month. And this was corroborated by 3 different witnesses. Now, one witness stated that, Mary and her family had stayed at his place on January 14th while they were selling handkerchiefs and stuff. However, there was another witness that came forward of lower social status. He was a fisherman, but he stated that during the time that Elizabeth was supposedly locked in the loft, that Mary was not out of town, that she was actually selling fortunes. She was like a fortune teller on top of everything. That's probably where she got the gypsy label. But she was selling fortunes out in the neighborhood, and she was never out of town. He knew her well. As for Susanna, she told the court that she had never seen Elizabeth before in her life, until the day that she was carried through that door and accused everyone of everything. Susanna also stated that Mary Squires was a lodger in her home, and she only saw Mary maybe 1 week in January because Mary was out of town selling her goods with her family. Now, as you know, especially in courts back then, and it's kind of true today, is that social status was given a lot of weight. So if someone with property or someone that was an employer was on the witness stand, their testimony was given more weight as more believable than some of those with a lower status. Since Elizabeth had supporters of the higher social status that testified, it was not surprising that both Mary and Susanna were found guilty. Now, for Susanna, because she was just charged with, keeping a disorderly house, she was actually branded on her hands. She was sentenced to serve 6 months in jail. Mary was sentenced to be hung because she stole a corset. Not everyone was satisfied with this verdict. Many did not like how Mary Squires was treated and labeled as a gypsy. They kind of felt sorry for her. Plus, there were many witnesses for Mary and Susanna that were unable to get through the mob at the courthouse, the mob of Elizabeth supporters, that they were supposed to testify on behalf of Mary and Susanna, but they weren't allowed to get through the mob. Like, the mob chased them off. Like, they wouldn't allow them into the courthouse to testify. So Mary and Susanna did not have as many witnesses as Elizabeth did. So was this really a fair trial? Also, Elizabeth had so many supporters who, donated money, bought the pamphlets, stuff like that. There was actually a lot of money left over, and Elizabeth took that money and upgraded her living conditions from renting a room to renting an entire flat. And that didn't sit well with some people either. So one of these people who were not satisfied with how this trial went was named Sir Crisp Gascon, or Gascony. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong. I'm going to go with Gascon. Crisp, great first name. He started off as a master brewer, so he earned some points there because he was higher society. Then he served as an alderman, and then he was knighted. So he had some pull around London. So what Crisp did is he started his own private investigation into this matter. And he was able to turn up like a lot of witnesses on Mary and Susanna's behalf. And a lot of them did put Mary out of town. So Crisp then specifically went and talked to Virtue Hall. It was because of her testimony during the trial that kind of he felt solidified Susanna and Mary's guilt. But he didn't believe that Virtue even believed her own story. So Virtue Hall would end up telling Crisp that what she told Henry Fielding to begin with, that she never met Elizabeth, she didn't know Elizabeth, there was no abduction, Elizabeth had never been in her house, that was the truth. and that she got scared of Henry because Henry kept threatening her with jail, telling her that she wasn't telling the truth. So she decided just to tell him what he wanted to hear because she was so scared of him. She went on to state, then after she gave this confession, the supporters for Elizabeth started showing her kindness, and she even got a little bit of money to support her family, and the last thing she wanted was that mob to turn on her. So with this evidence, Crisp wrote King George II on April 10th and requested that Mary Squires be pardoned from the death penalty. Now, the king did not pardon her completely from the death penalty at first, but he did say, "We will grant a stay of execution for 6 weeks so both sides can now redo their case." Now, ultimately, Mary Squires was pardoned on May 30th, 1973. So she was not put to death. Susanna Wells wasn't so lucky. She would end up serving her entire 6-month sentence, plus she was branded on her hand, but she was released from jail as well in August of 1753. Now, at this point, with the evidence that Crisp had collected, he declared Elizabeth an outlaw, saying that she committed perjury. Now, Elizabeth would come forward and turn herself into authority, saying she had nothing to hide. There was a lot of back and forth and a lot of delayed and whatever, but I'm just going to sum up what happened, okay? If you want to actually read exactly what happened, go to my resources and you will just see honestly, the shit show of what went on. Elizabeth went on trial for perjury, and this was a long drawn out case. While selecting the jury, they were being careful, of selecting the right people. However, when they selected a foreman for the jury, they later found out that this man allegedly called Elizabeth Canning in public a lying bitch, a cheat, and probably an imposter. So right away, you have somebody biased on the jury. So anyway, the prosecutors mainly called into question Elizabeth's description of the loft and how it didn't match what the loft actually looked like, especially if she spent an entire month there. Like, how could you be so off on the description? Plus, Crisp had his several witnesses that put Mary out of town a day before Elizabeth was supposedly brought to the house. So it couldn't have been Mary that cut off her corset and slapped her and everything like that. And these witnesses were of good social standing and character, so they held weight. Now, Elizabeth's defense had witnesses stating that they saw what they called a poor, miserable wretch walking along the road that went to London the day she escaped, but she was coming from what they considered the Wells' house. The other issues that were cited was it shouldn't take somebody 5 hours to walk 10 miles. And if it was so easy to escape, by Elizabeth's description, why didn't she escape before the month came up? But then the defense would come back and stated that she was scared and that's why she didn't escape. And also, if she was in such deplorable condition where she could barely walk, faint pulse, weak, it could have likely taken her 5 hours to go 10 miles. And we don't know how many fields she ran through before she was able to find that road. So once everybody testified, the jury was off. The jury took 2 hours and they came back and stated that they found Elizabeth guilty of perjury, but it was not willful or corrupt. She didn't mean to lie, that something probably happened to her and she really thought that these women might be responsible. She just could have been wrong. Now, the recorder for the court refused the verdict. He stated because it was a partial verdict and therefore not complete. So they needed to go back in there and do a full, complete verdict. So the jury goes back, takes an additional 20 minutes, and then comes back and says, all right, she's guilty of willful and corrupt perjury. which I find interesting because it's almost like, okay, we spent 2 hours debating this. Here's our thought. The recorder goes, no. It's not complete. You need to go back in there. And then they were like, they literally took 20 minutes. Like, dude, let's just get out of here. Let's just find her guilty and get the hell out of here. So Elizabeth was, of course, found guilty. And then she was sentenced to a month in jail. And then she was to be shipped off to another colony, which they did with low-level criminals a lot. They basically were kicking her out of London. Elizabeth would stick by her story the entire time, and she said she had no intent of ever putting anyone to death, but she was just telling her story and defending herself on what happened to her. Now, even after the trials were over, both sides of the case continued to fight each other. Newspapers would constantly print articles, which would just fuel the public fire as well. London was literally split down the middle on who they supported and stood by in this whole thing. Now, Elizabeth did end up, after serving her jail sentence, she was shipped off to Connecticut in the United States, where there was a colony, a Great Britain colony. And she arrived there in August of 1754. Now, her supporters, again, raised money and gave her money to get start a new life there. And they arranged her to live with a reverend's family, but not as a slave or a maidservant or anything like that, which most criminals were sent off to be. She was actually accepted into the family and treated as a family member. In November of 1756, at age 22, Elizabeth did marry a man named John Treat. They ended up having 7 children, but 3 of those children died at a pretty young age. Now, Elizabeth would die suddenly in 1773 at age 38. I couldn't find what she died of. So basically, Elizabeth could have been a victim that was not taken seriously due to her social status. Or she could have made the whole story up and was a great liar and manipulator. Now, this case has been gone over through the years by several lawyers, scholars, you name it, researchers, and people are still choosing sides today. There is not a majority that falls on each other's side, and that's what makes this case so interesting. You know, one person had a theory that she probably was abducted and attacked and whatever, but it just wasn't Mary and Susanna. You know, that was just kind of pushed into her head by John Winselberry and that other guy, Robert, because she said, I was on this road, I think, with this pawn. And so she just went along with it, you know? I mean, remember, she was 18 at the time. Technically, she was an adult, but she still had an 18-year-old mind, so she could have been pushed into it. We don't know. Another person had a theory that she became pregnant and she disappeared purposely to go have the baby because she was unwed, you know, and back then that was bad. Now, whether she got pregnant from, you know, being assaulted, whether she had a lover we don't know about, or back then apparently the lower status women were offered money to get pregnant and have a baby to produce an heir for noble couples that couldn't do so. So somebody said that that could have been the case as well. And there was another person who stated that Elizabeth wasn't at the Wells house, but was actually holed up at her employer, John Winselberry's house the whole time. And again, that was on that theory that she was pregnant and he was helping her out, whether he got her pregnant or a family member got her pregnant, I don't know. But that was the theory as well. All I know from this story is that neither side got a fair trial. I mean, let's be real about that, right? I mean, no one actually was executed over anything, so that was good, but a lot of people suffered from it. So I would love to hear what you think in the comments. Do you think Elizabeth lied? Do you think something happened but it wasn't the Wells? Do you think it was the Wells and they were just good at covering everything up? I just don't know what to think at this point. If you'd like to become a feline friend, please hit that subscribe button. And if you'd like to become a feline fan, hit that join button for special perks. I'm sorry, I really didn't have anybody on camera today. They're literally like all over the couch and stuff sleeping. So, and I hope my sound is richer with my new microphone. Isn't it pretty? Anyway, thanks guys, and we'll see you next week. Bye.